thank all of you for coming, not only tonight, but throughout the series. We all in the Center for the Study of War Society really appreciated your support, and hopefully we'll see you all in more in next year's lecture series. The image that I have up here, you might look at it and think, well, this is talk on Vietnam and the Vietnam War, so this is a combat maneuver in Vietnam. It actually is a combat training operation at Fort Polk in Louisiana. And I wanted to point it out because it's one of the connections that I'm going to talk about between the South and the Vietnam War, one of the ways in which the region that we are in here and the Vietnam War was very directly connected. I have a few other images of training sessions like this at Fort Polk that I'll show as I go through my talk. Throughout the course of this year's lecture series, we've grappled with the concept of a Southern way of war. Our speakers have tried to answer the question of whether such a thing exists. Is there a distinctly Southern response to war and militarization? Our speakers have also wrestled with perceptions, that regardless of whether a Southern way of war actually exists, why is there an image in the American psyche of a South that is more pro-military and in some interpretations more patriotic than the rest of the country? Dr. Wayne Lee of the University of North Carolina launched the series by challenging the idea that Celtic immigrants brought reckless military tactics with them when they settled in the American South. This undisciplined approach to war was nicknamed attack and die by the historian Grady McWhiney, who argued that it caused the South to lose the Civil War. Now, in response to McWhiney, Lee argued that the diversity of military practices brought by all of those various peoples who were considered to be Celtic resulted or made it impossible that a single transmission of a warfare practice would be likely. To understand the existence of the image of a Southern way of war, though, we must think about what Lee calls the invention of tradition. How and why have distinct images of a collective Southern response to wars and militarization been cultivated in American culture over time? Our own Dr. Susanna Ural investigated the images of a Southern military tradition that emerged in the years after the Civil War. She noted that rather than embracing an attack and die model, Southerners turned to military education and service as a way to bring law, order, and stability to a Southern society where white men were in control. A tendency towards violence, what Gerald McWhiney had argued for, a tendency towards violence does not equal the type of discipline that would have been discipline and restraint that was required of a 19th century soldier. The Southern military tradition of the post-Civil War era highlighted the honor and restraint of white Southern manhood in order to reestablish the pre-war social and racial order to the South. While Lee and Ural's lectures assumed a white Southern way of war, Dr. David Sylvia of Alvernia University shifted the focus to African American Southerners. And he focused on their views of military service in the Philippine-American War in the early 20th century as an avenue to full citizenship. It was one of the first times in the post-Civil War era in which African American servicemen were on the front lines of the struggle for freedom and equality at home, using their military service to demonstrate their worthiness of citizenship. Which brings us to the purpose of my talk this evening. About a year ago, I began to think about the American South and the Vietnam War. The images that often came to my mind when I think about the home front in the Vietnam War were images of protests, anti-war protests in northern cities, and protest movements on college campuses like the University of Wisconsin in Madison and the University of California in Berkeley. But how did the South experience the Vietnam War? The Vietnam War is one of the most momentous and transformative episodes of 20th century U.S. history, and a reference point that Americans continue to return to and to struggle to understand even in the present day. How did the South experience the Vietnam War? With its tradition of military honor, as well as its memory of defeat in the Civil War, what would the experience of the South in the Vietnam War tell us about a Southern way of war? And so I'm going to start and talk a little bit about numbers and share some statistics about what the South contributed to the American military effort in Vietnam. According to calculations by the Veterans Administration, approximately 31% of the U.S. personnel who served in Vietnam, U.S. military personnel who served in Vietnam from January 1st of 1965 to March 31st of 1973, this is the period in which the U.S. had combat troops in Vietnam, approximately 31% of that personnel were from the 11 states of the former Confederacy. Now, this percentage is less than half the total of all U.S. military personnel in Vietnam. But it's significant because at the time, the population of the South made up only about 25% of the population of the United States. Also, about 28% of those Americans who died in Vietnam were Southerners. Again, it's a percentage that was higher than the South's proportion of the U.S. population at the time. In the early 1970s, 4 out of 5 Army generals were from the South. Southerners' sacrifices in the war did not go unnoticed. 29% of Medal of Honor recipients were from the South. Now, as in any part of the country, there were many reasons why Southern soldiers went to Vietnam. From believing in the American mission there to the coercion of the draft. Owen Gilman, a professor of English who studies Vietnam War literature, notes that, quote, "The key to understanding the South's contribution to the war lies in the region's fundamental belief that a cause must be served with honor." He traces that belief back to the American Revolution, through the U.S. war with Mexico and the Civil War, and down into Vietnam. The voices of some Southern Vietnam War veterans provide a window on how their positions as Southerners influenced the way that they viewed military service. A man by the name of James Wilson, who is a Mississippian and who served in Vietnam as an Army press officer, interviewed Vietnam vets from the South for an oral history collection, and he found indications of a self-perception of difference as Southerners in the context of their military service. For example, he interviewed a vet by the name of Jack Candler, who was an Atlanta mortgage broker, and who was drafted in 1965 and served as a platoon leader with the 196th Light Infantry Brigade in Vietnam from 1968 to 1969. Candler went to war not because he had any political feelings about it one way or the other, but because he believed it was his duty to go. He says, "I come from a conservative, flag-waving family." Candler's mindset was like that of many of the Southern vets Wilson interviewed for his project. Wilson writes, quote, "Candler and most Southerners went to Vietnam when the South nurtured a strong vision of itself as a place deliberately set apart from and suspicious of mainstream America. By the late 1960s, the rest of the United States had come to regard the South, unfairly it should be noted, as a little more than a sullen redneck bastion hostile to social and political change," end quote. Wilson goes on to state that the Southern sense of being an outsider carried over to Vietnam, and it caused Southerners to seek each other out and create informal groups. Often those groups used Confederate imagery, especially the Confederate battle flag, to define themselves. Now, although the flag was heavy with racial meaning, vets like a man by the name of Spencer Campbell, who was a white Louisiana native who served in Vietnam with the Marines, believed that the battle flag symbolized a new lost cause. Owen Gilman, the English professor who studies Vietnam War literature, argues that Southerners' distinct experience with loss in war and consequent attempts to come to terms with that loss caused them to see their heritage in the Vietnam War. Among other vets Wilson interviewed was a man by the name of Houston Matthews, an Episcopal priest from Columbia, South Carolina, who served in Vietnam as a Marine rifleman from 1967 to 1968. He told Wilson about his family's military tradition that dated back to the Civil War. In addition, Raleigh, North Carolina native Mary Lorraine Hines, who was a Red Cross volunteer in Vietnam from 1968 to 1969, was told by a Red Cross official that the Southeast, again, the region that we are in, the southeast part of the United States, had the most applicants for Vietnam service and were, quote, "the best qualified ones," because the girls could take the heat and humidity in Vietnam and seemed to have the deepest feelings about supporting the men who were fighting the war. When she was a student at the University of Georgia in the mid to late 1960s, Hines sensed disapproval from some of her male friends when she told them she was volunteering for Vietnam. She discovered that many of them felt conflicted about the war. Maybe it was threatening to them that I was volunteering and doing all I could to go over there, and they were doing as much as they could not to go, she said. The Kappa Alphas, a fraternity, for example, were very gung-ho about the South's military tradition, Robert E. Lee and the Lost Cause. But Vietnam was different. I knew a lot of them were feeling conflicted inside because they weren't living up to the heritage of our region. Hines went on to say that once in Vietnam, Southerners tended to gravitate towards each other. Maybe it's because they could dance and talk like I did, and they knew what grits were, she said. There just seemed to be an instant bond between people from the South because of our common cultural heritage. James Wilson, in his introduction to the oral history collection that I've been drawing from, points to country music as one of those cultural unifiers for white Southerners. He mentions songs such as Loretta Lynn's Dear Uncle Sam, and Merle Haggard's Fight Inside of Me and Okie from Muskogee, which he first performed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. Lynn's song, which she wrote in 1966, gives the perspective of a wife whose husband has gone off to Vietnam to fight. The song captures the tension between her support of America's war effort and her fear for her husband's safety. In the song, Lynn sings, "My darling answered when he got that call from you. You said you really need him, but you don't need him like I do. Don't misunderstand, I know he's fighting for our land. I really love my country, but I also love my man. He proudly wears the colors of the old red, white, and blue, while I wear a heartache since he left me for you." The song ends in tragedy, with the wife receiving a telegram saying that her husband had been killed in action. Lynn, who is a Kentuckian and who now lives in Tennessee, spoke for some Southern women who, during the Vietnam War, may have struggled to reconcile their expressions of patriotism with the reality of what war did to their men. Okie from Muskogee was released in 1969. It's a song that Merle Haggard actually intended to be a satire. But its references to small-town life, conservative values, and opposition to the counterculture and the anti-war movement spoke to many listeners, and the song reached #1 on Billboard's Hot Country Singles chart. In the song, Haggard sings, "We don't burn no draft cards down on Main Street. We like living right and being free." Haggard's follow-up song, "Fight Inside of Me," explicitly criticizes those who speak out against the United States and its foreign policies. He sings, "I hear people talking bad about the way we have to live here in this country, harping on the wars we fight and griping about the way things ought to be." And he goes on to say, "When they're running down our country, man, they're walking on the fighting side of me. Running down the way of life our fighting men have fought and died to keep." Now, while it does not directly mention the Vietnam War, it provided a voice for those who opposed the anti-war movement and other activism against the Vietnam War. Like Okie from Muskogee, it also reached #1 on Billboard's Hot Country Singles chart. And the oral historian James Wilson argues that, quote, "By expressing the South's support for Vietnam, even as the rest of America wrote it off as a national debacle, such songs helped create a social and political milieu that generally made it easier for Southern veterans to come home than for their comrades from other parts of the country." As both Dr. Ural and Dr. Silby explained in their talks during this lecture series, race has been a key element in defining Southern perceptions of the military and war. In the post-Civil War era, military service was to exemplify the virtues of white Southern manhood and create conditions in which white men controlled the social and racial order. But if, in the post-Civil War period, the Southern military tradition became a way to enforce white male citizenship, what became of it when federal legislation dismantled Jim Crow? To understand Southern attitudes toward the military and war during the Vietnam era, we must consider the racial climate of the South in the years after World War II. With the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Services in the late 1940s, the military became a place that some African American Southerners viewed as an escape from Jim Crow. Moses L. Best, an Army communications specialist from rural North County in North Carolina, viewed the Army as a way to escape the segregated small towns of the South in the 1950s. Best had experienced personally the violence that often exploded out of the racial tensions in those towns. His father, who was a farmer, had been beaten by Klansmen for trying to secure buses for black school children. Best served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, the first from 1966 to 1967, and then again from 1969 to 1970. Roosevelt Gore was one of 10 children of a South Carolina sharecropper. and he welcomed his draft notice in 1966. Anything was better than the discrimination and oppression he faced on a regular basis growing up in Mullins, South Carolina. My father was very proud that I was going into the Army, he said. He wanted me to make a career out of it. I knew something was going on in Vietnam, but I didn't pay much attention to it. 2 of my Palmetto High classmates had joined the Marines and got killed over there, but Vietnam was still a long way off. Gore soon learned that military bases were not insulated from the surrounding racial climate. He was sent to Fort Jackson in South Carolina for basic training, where he was harassed by his white drill instructor. He didn't like blacks, Gore said. He always picked on blacks, maybe because we was from the South and he considered us illiterate. He liked to order me to get down on all fours and pick up cigarette butts with my mouth. Gore's training experience did get better after basic. He said that his advanced individual training experience was more professional and relatively free of racial harassment. African American women from the South also viewed military service as a way out. When Marie Rogers enlisted in the Army in 1952, she hoped to escape the racism she experienced in her native Alabama. She worked her way up to the rank of colonel in the Army Nurse Corps and spent her first overseas tour of duty in Korea. In 1967, she volunteered for an assignment in Vietnam because she wanted to be closer to combat. Stationed at the 24th Evacuation Hospital in Long Binh, Rogers managed the operating room, and that year the hospital received its first meritorious unit citation. Rogers later earned a Bronze Star, commending her management of her unit while under fire. She viewed the military as a place where black women had opportunities not available to them in civilian life. In other situations, as a black nurse, I wouldn't have gotten the kind of job I had, she said. She noted, however, that she usually was the only black medical staff member at her unit. No black doctors or surgeons ever were assigned to her team. Rogers' experience illustrates the prospects available to some black women in the military, but it also suggests the limits on African American advancement in the armed services. In some ways, the racial climate among U.S. service personnel in Vietnam mirrored that of the South. A poem by Yusuf Kominyaka, a Vietnam veteran from Bogalusa, Louisiana, captures the parallels. The poem is called Tu Do Street, and it's named for a street in Saigon where Vietnamese bar girls made a living off the dollars and desires of U.S. troops. Music divides the evening. I close my eyes and can see men drawing lines in the dust. America pushes through the membrane of mist and smoke, and I'm a small boy again in Bogalusa. White-only signs and Hank Snow. But tonight I walk into a place where bar girls fade like tropical birds. When I order a beer, the mama-san behind the counter acts as if she can't understand, while her eyes skirt each white face, as Hank Williams calls from the psychedelic jukebox. We have played Judas, where only machine gun fire brings us together. Down the street, black GIs hold their turf also. An off-limits sign pulls me deeper into alleys as I look for a softness behind the voices wounded by their beauty in war. Back in the bush at Dak To and Khe Sanh, we fought the brothers of these women we now run to hold in our arms. There's more than a nation inside us as black and white soldiers touch the same lovers minutes apart, tasting each other's breath without knowing these rooms run into each other like tunnels leading to the underworld. Now, none of this is to suggest that racism did not exist in the North during the Vietnam War era, or that African American service personnel from the North did not see homefront racism mirrored in Vietnam. But the South had come to stand for the nation's racial problems, and so descriptions of U.S. race relations in Vietnam often drew on the imagery of race in the South. In addition to contributing its men and women to the war effort, the South held bases where much of the training and deployment to Vietnam occurred. At least 19 U.S. Army bases that were active during the Vietnam War were in the South. The climate and the terrain of the South provided the closest match for what troops would encounter in Vietnam, and so places like Fort Pickett in Virginia and Fort Polk in Louisiana, I'll show you a couple more pictures, became major Vietnam training installations. Moses Best, who I mentioned earlier, had trained at Fort Pickett. And he said Fort Pickett has a lot of hills and valleys that look like Vietnam. By the time a lot of us got in country, we had a pretty good idea of what the terrain and the vegetation were like. With its humidity and swamps, Fort Polk was billed the birthplace for combat infantrymen for Vietnam. Fort Polk is also called Tigerland, and I'll show you just a few more pictures. Here's the sign that I just mentioned, birthplace for combat infantrymen for Vietnam, and you can see Tigerland. Another one referring to village warfare with the Viet Cong. So there were simulated Vietnamese villages that were created on bases like Fort Polk, and so that the American combat troops could train for their actual Vietnam experiences in conditions that were relatively similar, or as similar as you could get in the United States to what they would encounter in Vietnam. Here's another one of those training simulations at Fort Polk. And then just one more. It's difficult to see, but there are a couple of soldiers here hiding, again, in one of these training maneuvers. Fort Bragg in North Carolina was designated a training site for special forces in the 1950s, and its psychological warfare school hosted officers from Indochina beginning in 1953. President John F. Kennedy, who viewed the special forces as key to counterinsurgency in the Third World, visited the post in 1961. By the mid-1960s, Fort Bragg had also become one of the main sites from which U.S. Army troops deployed for Vietnam. Nearly 200,000 men trained there during the war. Fort Benning and Fort Gordon in Georgia and Parris Island in South Carolina also were major training sites for troops headed to Vietnam. Fort McClellan in Anniston, Alabama, held the headquarters for the Women's Army Corps. And during the Vietnam War, 51 Vietnamese women came from Vietnam and traveled to Fort McClellan to participate in an advanced training program with the Women's Army Corps. Medical personnel, including those serving in the Army Nurse Corps, trained at Fort Sam Houston in Texas before deploying to Vietnam. Because of the presence of major military bases throughout the region that were specifically used for Vietnam, the South was directly linked to the war. The war had economic and social consequences for the southern towns that housed those bases. In 1967, for example, 42% of the stateside payroll for military personnel went to 11 southern states. These dollars in turn fed a consumer economy in the military towns, where businesses sprang up to cater to service personnel. While department stores and restaurants made up part of this economy, it also contained a seedy underside in which a sex industry aimed specifically at servicemen employed local women. In Fayetteville, where Fort Bragg is located, Fayetteville, North Carolina, the area was known as Combat Alley, and with its bars, strip joints, and prostitutes, it mirrored Trudeau Street, the Saigon street that veteran Yusuf Komunyakaa wrote about in his poem. In fact, Fayetteville itself became known as Fayette-Nam. As the departure point for many troops headed to Vietnam, the war permeated the culture at Fort Bragg and its surrounding city. The dependence on federal dollars did not necessarily tamper a Southern suspicion of the federal government, however. This distrust was revealed in Southerners' support for Florida native Lieutenant William Calley, the Army officer convicted of murdering Vietnamese civilians in the village of My Lai in 1968. Calley often was criticized as a scapegoat for bad federal government policy. Characterized as a scapegoat for bad federal government policy. In 1971, a Calley supporter from Atlanta told Time magazine, quote, "He's one of the few real men left in this country. He's being crucified by his government and keeping his cool because he loves his country." Fred Moon, a resident of Martinez, Georgia, wrote a letter to the Augusta Chronicle in April of 1971, blaming the, quote, "Tonkin Bay Resolution hawks for the loss of American and Vietnamese lives in the war." Referring to Calley, Moon wrote, "If they are to be punished for doing their duty and protecting their lives as they see it, let's begin at malignant command posts of this cowardly policy. So let's turn turn the blame to the politicians who started and perpetuated the Vietnam War, not to the soldiers who were given the dirty work of fighting a war. A person identified as an ex-serviceman who was interviewed by a reporter for the Augusta Chronicle regarding the Calley conviction said, "It really makes me sad to hear of the decision. It seems like the same men who trained this man to kill have now turned against him when the time has come to place the blame. I used to believe that we were in Vietnam for a good purpose, but this is just another instance that makes me feel it is a dishonest political war." Jan Billman, a person who was interviewed for the same article, stated, "I was very disappointed with the decision and hoped he wouldn't be found guilty. I don't think a man should be found accountable for his actions in a time of war. If they're going to prosecute him, they should follow the chain of command all the way up to the president and prosecute them also." Some interesting perspectives on the Calley issue came from sixth graders at Birdie Elementary School in Dallas, Texas. In April of 1971, the Dallas Morning News ran an article about a class project. A teacher by the name of Janice Miner, she was a sixth grade English teacher. She had given her students a project that was related to a cartoon that had run in the Dallas Morning News about a week or so earlier. The cartoon was entitled Statistic, and it showed a battlefield in Vietnam with a combat helmet lying on the ground and the word Calley written across the combat helmet. So Janice Miner asked her students to write down their initial reactions to the cartoon, and then they would discuss the cartoon in class. And so here are a few of the responses. A boy by the name of Scott McCaffrey said this: "Calley was taken out of the war for killing the people he killed. I think he should get out of prison because it's not fair. He should not be in prison for doing the things he's trained to do." Tony Cosgrove said, "He tried to do his job, they throw him in the jail room. They even tried to ruin him, and the man that put him in the paper is for him, and I'm glad." He's talking about the cartoonist. "Calley is a good guy, and the writer is on his side. If he isn't, he will have trouble from me." A girl by the name of Lisa Traylor said, "Calley killed 22 people. It was not right to kill that many people, but still, if he is sent to Vietnam to kill people, it would not be right to put him in prison." A boy named Tim Henson said, "I think it means," referring to the cartoon, "I think it means that we are over there to fight or lose the war. I think that the cartoonist was on Calley's side. I am on Calley's side too." And finally, a boy named Tony Rayburn says, "Calley is one of our fighting men, and he went to help a country. What happens if he kills a bunch of people who had guns? What happens? They put him in prison for life." The children's responses reveal the sense that the soldier Calley was blamed unfairly for a war he did not start, and that he was being punished for following orders that came from someone on high who forced the dirty work of war on America's fighting men. Support for Calley was expressed further in a spoken word recording called "The Battle Hymn of Lieutenant Calley." The lyrics were written in April of 1970 by Julian Wilson and James Smith, a team of writers from Muscle Shoals, Alabama. And it was set to the tune of "The Battle Hymn of the Republic." The single was released in March of 1971 by Plantation Records, a Louisiana recording studio, and it sold more than 1 million copies in less than a week. It went on to sell about 2 million copies and was popular on country and western radio stations. The lyrics say this about Calley: "My name is William Calley. I'm a soldier of this land. I've tried to do my duty and to gain the upper hand. But they've made me out a villain. They have stamped me with a brand as we go marching on. When all the wars are over and the battle's finally won, count me only as a soldier who never left his gun, with the right to serve my country as the only prize I've won, as we go marching on." As in other responses to the Calley issue, the Battle Hymn of Lieutenant Calley paints him as an obedient soldier who had been made a scapegoat for an unpopular war. Now, this is not to suggest that all Southerners supported Calley or the Vietnam War. Protests against the war and ROTC programs occurred on college campuses in the South, including the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the University of Georgia, and the University of Southern Mississippi. the University of Mississippi. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which was founded at Shaw University in North Carolina and became one of the main activist groups of the civil rights movement, spoke out against the Vietnam War beginning in 1966. SNCC linked the oppression of African Americans in the U.S. to violence against the Vietnamese perpetrated by American troops. But the assumed wisdom about Southerners in the Vietnam War seems more accurately reflected in the music of Loretta Lynn and Merle Haggard, sometimes ambivalent about specific wars, but always supportive of the troops. And so the question that this year's lecturers have grappled with, and will continue to try and understand, is why? Why this image of a Southern attitude towards war? In the case of the Vietnam War, part of it is related to physical realities. The number of Southerners who served in Vietnam and the military bases where training for the war took place. Add that to public statements about Southern honor and military duty, and together these factors promoted an image of a Southern way of war, even if Southerners' responses weren't always different from those voiced by Americans in other parts of the country. Also, the Vietnam War reflected the racial tensions of the era that the South had come to symbolize, even though those tensions played out in other parts of the U.S. too. Finally, the South's legacy of defeat in war found new, and this time nationwide, expression in the Vietnam experience. Thanks, everyone.